How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. His sabatons kept slipping in the thin layer of muck that covered the stony ground, and every time he stumbled, the monstrosity began to close the distance between them. His footfalls clanked and splashed dully, beating out a rhythm of haste that matched the pounding of his heart. He could hear the creature's breath, even at a distance. A struggling sound, as if the huge thing could hardly bear its own weight. That didn't stop it from crashing forward, driving fists into the slimy ground when it gauged itself close enough to try and crush Pierce to a pulp. Every time it missed, it roared and uttered a booming curse in its unfathomable language. Every time it missed, Pierce gave a prayer of thanks that he would not walk the glorious paths this day. Not that it would be so bad, of course, when it was time to die. "I'm just too young," he gasped as he ran. He choked on the foul stench of the monstrosity. It smelled much like the rest of the Underlands. Musty, half-rotted, only much stronger. Probably because it was so close. Pierce slipped again and heard the rush of air as the monstrosity's foot came falling toward the earth. He caught a glimpse of the horrid thing as he righted himself. It towered overhead, easily 70 feet tall, and though most of its features were obscured in the darkness, he could see its long beard wagging back and forth, soggy and dripping with an oily substance. "Yuck," Pierce muttered and bounded away. He'd already been running for days. His training really had paid off. More than that, as bad as his luck could get, he was swaddled in physical boons. The blacksmith had given him many gifts. Silver moonlight glistened on the slick ground, revealing just enough of what was ahead of him to avoid the odd stalagmites sticking up to bar his way. Occasionally, the monstrosity would rip one from the ground and throw it at Pierce, a stone missile exploding into thousands of fragments that bounced off his bright armour. Only a holy blessing kept him from being crushed. A shadowy structure appeared up ahead, an old castle left to rot in the endless mire of the Underlands. It had a modest outer wall that had been breached in several places, with tall, spindly parapets, dozens of narrow walkways spanning the gaps between them. Were any of them tall enough for what he had in mind? Pierce sprinted along the south side of the ruined castle, making as if to continue past it. Nimbly, he dodged into a shadowy forest of columns that no longer had a roof to support. He found what he had hoped for there, an intact stairwell leading into a central tower. If he could get up high. The stairs were damp with condensation, every step a risky venture. The stairwell terminated in a hallway that had been barricaded with furniture at some time long past. He charged towards this, barreling through it with an armoured shoulder. Mouldy splinters of wood burst forth as he crashed into the hall beyond. He glanced to the left and right, looking for a way to get higher. Outside, the monstrosity reached the castle and pounded on its remaining walls. Pierce heard the ancient stone blocks tumbling to the hard ground, splatting into the coating of muck, scraping along the wet stone beneath. A fist the size of a boulder tore through the wall at the other end of the hallway, ripping apart a huge portion of the castle structure. Crashing sounds echoed from every direction. Pierce looked up, and moisture from the ceiling dripped onto his faceplate. He looked at the gauntlet on his right hand. 2 of the 5 gems set into it still glowed a deep orange. He growled. 1 for the ceiling, 1 for the giant skull. He thrust his gauntleted hand upwards and triggered the blast with his mind. A lance of red-orange fire bore into the blocks of dark stone, reducing them to clouds of hot dust. With a mighty thrust, Pierce leapt through the hole and onto the roof. was met by the monstrosity's contorted face. Skin gnarly like the bark of a tree, its wet beard dripping black sludge onto the castle roof. Pierce dashed for its right eye as it opened a mouthful of broken teeth to roar. He drew his longsword from a sheath at his side, its blade glowing bright blue. The giant's attention went immediately to the weapon, and its eyes widened in fear or rage. Pierce cocked his fist back, then thrust it towards the giant's eye and triggered his final blast. His aim would have been perfect, but for the massive fist that backhanded him by surprise. He nearly lost his grip on his precious sword as he careened through the air, away from the ruined castle. He hit the ground hard, splashing down in a thin layer of muck, feeling it seep into the seams between the pieces of his armour. Wasted the shot, he muttered, getting up and starting to run again. The ground was softer here, and it made the boot sticking worse. He needed to find a way out of the Underlands. If he didn't get back to the Overland to tell everyone about the invasion, well, there was no one else who knew. The Underlord's plans would proceed unchecked. The monstrosity didn't give him another moment to think. It had easily spotted the shining blue blade and came stomp-jogging to catch up. Pierce could see where his desperate gauntlet blast had hit, blowing off the giant's ear which now dangled from the side of its skull, dripping blood or sludge. The thing didn't seem fazed by this, and came on as if no head trauma had been suffered. Pierce sheathed the sword and scanned the environment desperately for hope. If the ruined castle was anything less than a few thousand years old, it would have been near a temple, and a temple should have been built around a convergence. He could use that to get back up to Overland. So, where was the temple? There. A mound of earth with a spire protruding upward. That could be it, but if it wasn't... He committed himself. Pierce sprinted toward the mound, searching for that peculiar feeling of unease he knew should be there. He felt nothing. Then, he did feel something. Right near the spire, not quite where the centre of the temple should have been. It was the feeling like the need to vomit, like his guts desired to crawl out of his body and into the muck. He tried to focus. Imagine climbing, he said to himself. The monstrosity was almost on him. His voice quavered in a whine. Come on! He felt a tingle. Then an itch across the surface of his skin. The sensation of moving backward, being pulled up by the neck. The slithering moon faded away to be replaced by the roiling red fire of the sun. He'd never been so happy to see its bloody tendrils flicking about the black sky, pulling it across the vault of day. Now he was standing on a grassy knoll, the muck of the Underland slipping off his sabatons. The grass recoiled, but couldn't escape. Pierce let out a breath of relief. The ground beneath him heaved abruptly upward, tossing him several feet to the side. Pierce recovered to see that the monstrosity had appeared, buried from the knees down in the soft earth. It had heaved 1 foot out of the ground and was working on the other, screaming at Pierce unintelligibly. He was in shock. People had always said that the monstrosities wouldn't come up to Overland, for they hated the light of the sun, but here it was. He shook his thoughts away and turned to run. There had to be a town around here somewhere. So you've paid him up to Jubilee? Scythia asked her husband. He grinned and put a rough hand over hers. The place is ours till then, darling, he said. We don't have to take just any old cliff-licking jobs anymore, just the good ones. There are good cliff-licking jobs, she quipped. Her husband laughed. She loved seeing him happy like this, his smile surfacing from beneath that thick red beard. He'd been so proud of that last bounty, so insistent on taking it despite the danger. She had to admit it had paid off. New armour, lots of food, and rent paid for the next 5 years. She'd been looking to settle down for a while. "We did good, Axie," she smiled at him, crowning his hand with hers. He blushed a little at the nickname, looking around as if he were concerned that someone had heard. His grin returned when he saw no one was near enough to hear. "So, it's more mead for us then. Celebration demands it," he said, motioning to the barkeep to refresh their steins, taking a long draught to drain his own. Scythia winced as a sudden stab of pain shot through her temples, igniting the red gems in her silver circlet. Axebourne saw them light up and surged to his feet. "Which direction?" he hissed, peering out the windows and into the street. She shook her head. "I don't know, but it's coming fast, whatever it is," she said as the sharp pain dissipated. Her Circlet of Knowing could be a cruel accessory. Together they rushed out into the muddy street and searched for danger in both directions. Scythia felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, rippling the puddles of water left by the morning mists. "West," she said, and they both sprinted off in that direction, mud splashing up onto their treated leather boots. Axebourne had drawn his weapon, a halberd with an extendable steel shaft that snapped out to full length at his touch. The edges of its blade were lit with yellow fire. Scythia followed suit, resting the chain of her spiked flail on her shoulder. Then she saw it. A sickly face of black, scarred skin stretched over a skull the size of a potter's hut. When was the last time a monstrosity this big had come to Overland? The thing groaned as it came, chasing after something Scythia couldn't see, swiping at structures in its way with those gnarled, massive hands. Townsfolk screamed. Buildings sagged and collapsed. Dogs were barking, cats yowled as they fled. "It's fixated on something below," Scythia hollered to her husband. "Let's get up high before engaging." He nodded, and they altered their course to head for the temple. It wasn't as tall as one in a big city might be, but she would take any elevation she could get against that thing. They raced down the muddy roads until they came to the main street, the one that led to the temple. There were still hundreds of feet between them and the monster. Now she could see its prey. A lanky man, encased in bright armor splashed with mud and black goo. He too sprinted for the temple, and Scythia saw his posture straighten when he caught sight of her and Axebourne. She kept glancing back at him as she followed Axebourne to the temple. On this stretch, lamps lined the street, their gems unlit but visible behind their glass casings. The tall armoured man flicked his sword out at one of the lampposts, severing the post, causing it to crash to the ground. He plunged a hand through the glass to grab the gemstone inside, looking back to check the monstrosity's position. He dashed up to the next lamp and repeated the process. Scythia and her husband made it to the temple. She paused on its steps while he went on ahead. The armoured man had collected several gems and struggled to insert them into his gauntlet while he ran. The giant gained on him. Scythia hailed him with one hand and pointed up into the temple to indicate her plan. He nodded as he ran, but she thought she saw him slowing down as he neared. She shot through the temple's open doors and into its foyer. Twin staircases led up to an open mezzanine on the second floor. With long legs, she bounded up the steps, 4 at a time. When she joined Axebourne on a balcony overlooking the temple grounds, she saw that the armoured man had stopped to await the monstrosity in the street beyond. Brave or stupid? She figured he must have a plan. "You've chased me from the depths of that sickly pit you call home," the man cried at the giant. His voice sounded young. "I'm tired of it! Come on, come get it, you cliff licker!" Such language near a temple, Scythia thought. He's not orthodox. The monstrosity obliged, surging forward at the sound of the man's voice. It closed the distance, cocking an arm back, ready to swing and swat the man into paste. When only a few meters separated the two, the man drew his longsword. It blazed blue, its vibrancy jarring amid the grey and brown of the town's buildings, the red and gold of the temple grounds' bricks and ornaments. The monstrosity flinched, squinting at the unusual colour and its bright light. The man fired a mighty blast of orange fire into its lower leg. Flesh blew away like smoke, leaving only white bone. One of the gems on the man's gauntlet went dark. The giant fell to one knee, swinging its arms blindly toward the ground, in search of the armoured man. It obliterated an ornate fountain, uprooted an old tree, but missed the man. The armoured warrior rushed the giant and fired a second blast of fire at the ground beneath his feet, propelling himself up into the air. He soared, and Scythia smiled. She'd never seen someone use a blast gauntlet that way before. It was amazing his arm didn't break, but some overlanders were just naturally tough. A third blast sent the man flying even higher. A fourth blast, aimed behind, sent him closer to the giant's head. And a final shot deflected the huge creature's hand as it tried to knock the man away. It lurched, screaming in pain as its hand disintegrated into a mess of black skin and white bone. The armoured man cleaved down the centre of its horrid face with his blade, setting its wet beard afire with blue flame. The monstrosity toppled backward, the man falling with it. He impacted its chest and rolled down to the ground. Pierce lay in a heap next to the giant as it twitched with the final impulses of its wretched life. He winced, trying to catch his breath. "You all right, stranger?" came a voice from up the street. "That wasn't pretty." Pierce tried to blink his eyes into focus, but they wouldn't obey. A black and red blur approached. It was tall. Its voice was husky. Pierce flipped up his faceplate, took off his left gauntlet and rubbed his eyes. The blur resolved. She offered him a hand. He took it. Let the woman help him stand up. "Thanks," he said. The woman had the build of a Westerling. Tall, wide hips and shoulders, thick corded muscles that were flattered by the mould of her dyed leather armour. Her jet black hair was tied into a ponytail that stuck up above her gem-infused circlet. Her face was broad, angular, with bright yellow eyes and cheeks painted as if for war. "Gorgonbane," Pierce commented on the war paint's pattern. "They did good work back in Alba." The woman didn't say anything, just gave him a polite smile. Pierce flinched, having a thought. "Wait, no, you're not..." "Scythia of Chasm Reach," she introduced herself, clasping his arm in greeting. The woman was a living legend, and he'd just been stupid enough to assume her war paint was borrowed. A tribute. "How did I look out there?" he grimaced, honestly curious about his performance. Recruitment was part of the reason he'd been in this mess to begin with. "I know the situation wasn't ideal, but you wouldn't believe where I just came from." "You actually look pretty good from where we were standing," Scythia said, raising her brow. "We? Ah, right. There had been a man with her. If this was Scythia of Chasm Reach, the man had to be..." The man strode up casually beside his wife, taking Pierce's arm in a firm grip. He was built like a tree, tall, gnarled, strong, and little about him was refined or attractive. His face was hard set under its thick covering of red beard. but his eyes were earnest and approving. "Axebourne," he said. "The Cleaver." Pierce breathed in awe. "Sir, it's an honour to meet..." He flicked his gaze to Scythia. "To meet both of you. Mr. Cleaver, my dad, fought with you years ago. He told me so many stories." Axebourne screwed up one side of his mouth and scratched the side of his red head. "Making me feel old, kid," he said. "Sorry, sir," Pierce said. "Ugh, don't do that," Axebourne groaned. "What?" asked Pierce. "Apologising or calling you sir?" "Neither." "Sorry, sir. It's just really exciting." Axebourne shook his head. "Look, my wife's right," Axebourne said. "You did all right. It's not always pretty, kid, but that thing's dead and you're alive. I'd say job done." He looked over at his wife. "Buy him a drink." The tavern Scythia and Axebourne brought him to was a dump. It was tucked into the corner of a row of closed shops, its front entrance blocked off so you could only enter through the alleyway. Inside it was dim, low-ceilinged, stuffed with regulars, and quiet in that way only a long-established drinking house can be. The barkeep imperceptibly raised a wet rag to greet the two living legends and their guest. A pair of merchants stood near a lonely wooden pillar in the middle of the long room, looking as if they wished to sit, but only one table was open, and it was the one that the legends led Pierce to. He removed his helm and set it down on the sticky floor. Thankfully, the chair was sturdy enough to accommodate the bulk of his armour. Most furniture would be in a place like this. Sitting, Axebourne raised a hand, holding up 3 fingers, and not long after, a server came by with 3 steins full of golden mead. It smelled sweet, but tasted dry and strong. Pierce dove into it greedily, relishing the distance it put between him and thoughts of the Underland. "So," Axebourne prodded, and Pierce realised he'd gotten lost in the moment. "Ah, yes. Sorry, sir," he apologised and sat up straight in his chair. Axebourne bulked, scrunching up his face. "Sir, again. I ain't your officer boy," he said, "but do tell us. What was that all about?" Pierce closed his eyes, as if remembering something distant. Well, he had been down in the Underlands a while, hadn't he? "The most important things first, if you don't mind," he said. "Cash has found a way to invade Overland. I have to stop him." Axebourne looked incredulous. Scythia frowned. "Just you? And how do you know this?" she asked. "I was trapped in Testadel," Pierce said. "It was embarrassing but true." Axebourne made another face, and like the first, Pierce thought it strange on him. He seemed so serious, but his honest confusion and big red lips made the look of disbelief humorous. Pierce thought he would make a good dad. He realised he'd paused again. "Sorry," he said, tapping one of his temples. "Get sidetracked." He cleared his throat and tried once more. "I went down to the Underlands to get my tribute," he said. "I figured if I came back with something awesome, something brutal, I could get the post I wanted in Gorgonbane. Or some other group like yours. Your old one, anyway," Pierce started. Had he just insulted them? They didn't react. "I mean, I don't actually know what you're up to now. Not that you have to be up to something, but Gorgonbane really kicked." "It's okay," Scythia said calmly. She fixed his green eyes with her yellow ones. "Did the gems in her circlet brighten?" "Stay on track." "Right," Pierce said. "So I drove down at Merkfathom and..." "Wait," Axebourne cut in. "You swam to the Underlands?" Pierce nodded. "Through Merkfathom?" "Yes, sir," he said. "It was nasty, but I figured that would be a great feat to tell the other mercs about. Get some clout. But have you ever seen a Shriek-keel?" "Heard, I should say. You don't see much in Merkfathom. They really scream. Feel it right in the gut and then..." He cut himself off Axebourne didn't believe him. His face wrinkled in an amusing scowl. "Look, sir," he said, trying to keep eye contact with the cleaver. "That won't be the craziest thing I say, and I'll stay on track better if I stop seeing your faces, so please don't be offended, but I'm just going to address Mrs. Scythia. Or is it Mrs. Cleaver?" "Faces?" Axebourne said. "You make some wonderfully entertaining faces, Axebourne, my love," Scythia said with a tiny smile. The cleaver blinked and shrugged, gesturing with an open hand that Piers should go ahead. "So McFathom opens into a waterfall that runs down the jagged mountains east of the Testadel, which I didn't really know, but I do now," Piers continued, keeping his eyes on Scythia. "So be careful if you ever go that way, because some of it's jagged, like I said. Saw some bodies that got real cut up. I mean, I guess they did, because I just saw skeletons stuck on the rocks. So anyway, I rode the falls down until I could go on foot and headed down out of the mountains. I wasn't going to try for Testadel, but after I killed a Father Dogrin..." Axebourne opened his mouth to say something, but Scythia put a hand over his and he shut it. "The mother and pups chased me into the death hedge and I had to go through to the other side." "But why would you have to kill?" Scythia began, then said, "Never mind, go on." "My food got wet," Piers said. "I had to steal the heinous hog the Father Dogrin had just hunted down so I could eat." He took a long draught of his mead. Just thinking back to all of it was exhausting. "Why not just go hunting?" said someone from a nearby table. Piers turned toward an older man with tufty white hair. "Too much work," Piers said. "Dogrins don't run away." He turned back to Scythia. "So, Testadel's back gate was open, since you're supposed to die in the dead hedge maze anyhow. So I went in that way. Had to. And this forge master sees me and says, 'You came in the back. You're too nuts to rat out. I'd rather see what happens to you. You can come on in if you promise not to kill me.'" "Wait!" came a voice from behind Piers. He turned to look. It was one of the seatless merchants. He had a crazy accent. Was he an Eastern cliff dangler? "But how did you make it through Dead Hedge?" "Oh," said Piers, craning his neck to address the man. "It's the armour. Puncture enchantment. They can pierce almost anything unenchanted, but the arsenic barbs on the hedge couldn't poke me to poison me." He turned back to Scythia. "So I watched where the Forge Master went, but I pretended I was heading into the dungeons. He didn't look back again, and I followed him up to the smithy." "But you're supposed to go to the dungeons," said a patron from another table. "That's how you get the tribute for your band." Piers turned toward the man. "Yeah, but I wanted something special, remember?" he said. "I kept thinking about all the things they make up in the smithy that don't make it down to the dungeons, and I thought, would I send the coolest thing I've ever made down to the dungeon to be a weapon for some cliff-licking pain reaper?" Piers turned toward the merchant with the cliff dangler accent and said, "No offence." The man made a puzzled face. "So right before the Forge Master went into his forge, he noticed me and said, 'Really? Is it because I said something?' So I grabbed him by the apron, picked him up, shoved him into the forge and made him close the door." "Wait," came another voice, the barkeep. "Aren't Forge Masters made 8 feet tall?" "Yeah," said Piers, glancing over his shoulder. "And they weigh over 1/2 a ton," said the barkeep. "Yes, sir, far as I can tell," said Piers. He turned back to Scythia. "So he begged me while I had my blast gauntlet to his chin, and I said, 'Give me your best sword and I'll let you live.' Which of course I was already going to do since he'd let me in, as long as he didn't raise the alarm." "And that's the sword there on your scabbard," said a woman from another table. "Well, come on, let us see it." Piers shook his head. "No, he didn't have any swords. He only made dust for light enchantments. So he told me that, and I put him down and asked him where the sword makers were, and he told me. I was about to leave him behind, and he said, 'But hey, I made this dust.' The overseer couldn't even stand to look at it. She told me to throw it away before, but I couldn't bring myself to do that. Have you ever seen this colour before?" He pulled a vial out of his apron and it was the most beautiful dust I've ever seen. People all across the tavern started guessing. Pierce thought probably according to their favourite colours. No one guessed right until Scythia. Blue, she said, and everyone else shut up. It was for a blue light. Pierce nodded. So he gave it to me and made me the promise not to tell anyone where it came from if I got captured. But the Pain Reapers never ended up asking anyway. Axebourne had held his tongue for too long. He shook his head. No, you did not get caught by the Pain Reapers and escape. Pierce pulled down the top of his right ear to show Axebourne the point where the Pain Reapers had inserted their harvesting needle. There was an angry red scab there, the size of a nail head. Someone whistled lowly. It was stupid. I didn't listen through the doorway before I left the Forge Master's room. There was a patrol just coming up the stairwell as I started going down and there was nowhere else to run. They got me. So the Reapers kept trying to get information out of me, but I didn't have a clan or a merc band yet, and I'm not a mage, so I really didn't have anything they wanted. And after a while, they started leaving me alone in my cell. Best I can tell, I was down there for 5 weeks. Licked up more wall scum than I care to admit, let me tell you. Pierce took another long draught of his mead, finishing it. The barkeep was already waiting to give him more. So one night I guess, not sure. One night there was a scuffle down past my cell and everyone's attention was off me. And that Forge Master came up to the bars of the cell. He looked all wide-eyed and concerned, and I could see he had a bone melter in his hand. He told me he couldn't stand it anymore. He needed to know the name of the colour he'd made. He said he'd let me out if I told him, so I did. So he cut the lock out of the gate with the bone melter and then gave it to me. He showed me how to use the light dust on it, made me promise I'd tell everyone his name. He wanted everyone in both our lands to know who had finally synthesized what he felt was the most beautiful colour of all. He insisted it was the greatest thing he'd ever done. The room waited in silence. So, what was his name? Asked one of the merchants. Forge Master 77, Pierce said. People groaned at the mundanity. Pierce took another drink. So with all the distractions, I made it out of the dungeon and to the front gate. I cut the crossbar with the bone melter and let myself out. That's where the monstrosity almost got me. And chased you all the way to a convergence, Axebourne said. Pierce nodded. Yes. And your sword is a bone melter, Axebourne said. Pierce nodded again. They were silent a moment as everyone took a drink. May I see it? Axebourne asked. We saw it, Scythia said flatly. Her husband wrinkled his brow at her. See it melt bone, he said. Pierce started. He should have thought of that. He'd meant to show the thing off. That was the whole point of his dive to begin with. Yeah, of course. Barkeep, Axebourne called. Bring us a bone. The barkeep complied, ducking into a room in the back of the tavern and returning shortly with a hog's spine. Pierce looked at him funny. A spine? The barkeep shrugged. He laid the bone on the table. Pierce stood and unsheathed his sword. It shone forth with a brilliant blue light, obscuring the orange of the oil lamps spread throughout the tavern. People gasped in awe. Pierce smiled. He brought the edge of his blade down slowly, careful not to touch the table with it, and let it rest lightly on the hog's spine. More force would mean a faster melt. Immediately the pores in the bone began to bubble and its surface grew slick and shiny like wax. Within moments, it was no more than a stained white puddle, slowly re-hardening on the tabletop. Pierce sheathed the sword. You lucky muck-sucking, Axebourne trailed off. I can't believe it. But wait, said Scythia. You said Cash is planning to invade Overland. It's been a long time. You were there, weren't you? Pierce said. They nodded. Well, it's true. How? And how do you know? Well, there was an old wizard locked up a few cells down from mine. I didn't get his name, but the Reapers were interrogating him harshly. I'm pretty sure they took all his fingernails first. He blinked away the memory. Anyway, they wanted to know about all the convergences he'd found. Apparently he knew a lot. They wanted to know how close each one was to major cities, and if there was any high ground or low ground nearby. Then they killed him. Pierce frowned. But if Cash just plans to use convergences, Axebourne said, couldn't he have invaded any time? Well, that's what I was thinking, Pierce agreed. But I always thought the Underlanders wouldn't come up because they hated the Red Sun, right? So I thought it might have something to do with that, but you just saw that monstrosity up here and he didn't care, so... He shrugged. Scythia shook her head. We've seen Underlanders up top before, just not very often. They won't attack en masse because they know they'd just be slaughtered at the convergence points. Myths say something about the aversion to sunlight, but I've never observed it. All I know is the Reapers were talking with each other about making the big push soon. They kept using words like that. Rise, push, lift. And I still might have written it off, but they said they were going to conquer Grondel first. And soon it wasn't just idle talk. The everlasting temple, someone breathed. Could mean to demoralise Overland, said the barkeep. Or it's just the easiest place to do. Whatever they're going to do, Pierce said. So I didn't really know where I'd end up after riding the convergence, but here I am. I figure I need to go to Grondel and do what I can to help. Warn them, at least. Will you come too? They'll believe you sooner than me, even if it is life or death. There was a long quiet. Everyone sipped gingerly on their mead. All eyes turned to Axebourne and Scythia, waiting for their answer. It's a pretty crazy story, kid, Axebourne said. How do we know we can trust you? That you're not just some nutcase looking for attention? Pierce shrugged. Hard to say, sir. Anyone could just make up whatever stories they want, and you'd never know without looking for yourself, right? You're a terrible salesman, Axebourne said, eyes half-lidded. That's what my dad always said, so I just ended up cleaning the shop instead of greeting the customers. Your father, said Axebourne. You said he knew me. Tell me his name. Don't know if you'd remember, Sir Cleaver, Pierce said. They called him Flay. Flay Ice Eyes. Axebourne's eyelids rose. I do remember, he said. You don't see a gaze that hard every day. Axebourne looked at Scythia. Hard to believe that man had kids. Scythia tilted her head in agreement. You're telling me, Pierce said. Mum's a special lady. Axebourne pursed his big lips at Pierce. Quite the warrior, though. Tree doesn't stand far from the apple, Pierce said. He grinned, hoping he looked more trustworthy and not stupid. Saved my life once, Axebourne said. He'd tell you that. Now it was Pierce's turn to look surprised. No. Figures, though. It was like pulling teeth just to get a hold of the fact he served under you at all. Not a big one for stories, Dad. Well, maybe I'll tell you sometime, Axebourne said. He mused. The land is in peril, probably. The kid's dad saved my life. I call him father, Pierce said. He seemed to confer with Scythia silently, a question on his face. What do you think, love? Axebourne finally asked his wife. She looked at Pierce intently, and the gems on her circlet glowed again. Pierce wondered what magic they were working. I think, she said, we follow him to Grondel. Scythia lay next to her husband in bed that night. Pale moonlight waltzed into the room, illuminating his feet sticking out from under the covers. She'd never understand how he could sleep that way. Her feet were always cold at night. "Do you think it's really that serious?" she asked him. "This business with cash after all this time?" His eyes were closed, but he was still awake. He took a long time to answer. "Somehow I do," he said. "I don't know where that kid got so strong, so I didn't want to believe him at first. But your Circlet of Knowing would have told us, right?" "Yes," she said lowly, still unsure, and that quite against her will. She was normally sure of everything. Unless he had some kind of counter-enchantment. But look at him. He's like some kind of lost puppy. It's almost like his dumb luck and animal cuteness conspire to keep him out of trouble. Axie opened his eyes and they glimmered in the dark. "Animal cuteness, huh?" Scythia rolled her eyes. "The point is, he's too earnest to be lying. And if he is lying, then he's really good at it. The epitome of evil and even more powerful than we've seen of him so far." "Dumb luck," Axie mused. "No, it does look that way. But swimming the Merc Fathom, slaying a Dogrin, lifting a Forge Master bodily off the ground. If it's all true, I haven't seen anyone like him since Agrathor," Scythia finished. Agrathor was one of the original members of Gorgonbane, and probably the most powerful. A shame what happened to his body. "Speaking of," said Scythia, turning her head toward Axie, "do you think we should go get him?" "Aggie," he said, pursing his big lips. I don't know if he'd be angrier if we did than if we didn't." "You never know till you try with him." "True. I guess we might as well." "You think he'll get along with the kid?" Axie asked. "I think the kid'll get along with him," Scythia replied. "Seems like that type, doesn't he?" Axie smiled. "Curse him, I already like the lad." Axie turned to face her. She twirled a long finger in his fiery beard, and he purred. "Do you ever wonder what our kids would have looked like?" he asked. He asked her this exactly once every year, and never remembered it. She hid her chuckle. "You ask me that every year," she said. "I don't think so." He closed his eyes again. "I'd remember your answer." "But yes, of course I have," she said. "Stunning, mighty, my yellow eyes, your red hair, my height." "My sense of humour?" "Yes, love, but that you can teach. My darker skin, your big lips." "By the blacksmith, but not my face." "Oh, love," said Scythia. "Why do you say that? I think you're very beautiful." Axie laughed, low and rumbling. "You have to say that. You're my wife." "I've heard plenty of wives that admit to their husband's lack of a charming facade. Doesn't mean they love them less." "See, you admit it," Axie said. "It's okay. I came to terms with it long ago. Scares away the trolls even. Besides, why be pretty when it'll all just melt away anyhow?" Scythia cleared her throat. Axie laughed again. "Well, not you, of course." He reached up and caressed her cheek. "Lovely as the day we met. You have to say that because you're my husband." "Yes, love, I do. Doesn't mean it's not true." Scythia's long dark hair had spilled across his chest. Axie kept curling it around his wrist like a bracelet. "Baby would have been the kid's age," he said, softly. "I thought that too," she said. Scythia pictured the grown baby in her mind. It was hard not to see Pierce, armour and all. Had it really been that long ago? Axie's stomach growled mightily and his eyes got big. Scythia smirked. "Always the same time of night," she teased. "Want me to go get you something?" Axie moved to get up, but she pushed him back down. "I can do it, darling," he protested. "No," she said. "I get your snack, you rub my feet. Good?" "Deal," he said, and relaxed. She'd probably have to wake him up when she returned. Scythia wrapped herself in a plush nightrobe and stepped out into the hall. They put Pierce up in their guest room and she peeked in the open door. The big kid sprawled on a bed too short for him, looking like he'd plopped right down on it after washing up. He looked thin out of his armour, tan skin gleaming in a bit of moonlight. Even in sleep he seemed coiled to spring up at a moment's notice. Yet he snored, lightly. Would her child have been a warrior? Most in Overland were, at least for a time. The world was just too dangerous not to train them. She'd never told Axie that she'd meant to discourage it, though. Something else would have been nice. An artist or a baker like Axie's sister. Even a librarian mage in Grundel. Pierce's sword hand twitched and he bared his teeth soundlessly. Scythia smiled. This one was a warrior to the core. "Blacksmith keep him," she prayed softly. "What has he brought upon us?"